How's it going, everybody? I'm really excited for today's episode because instead of the typical me talking about football or something else about sports, I'm going to be doing another interview like what I did with Jade almost a year ago now. I'm interviewing a girl who has a podcast called The Bright Eyed, and it's a podcast about change and inspiration. And honestly, it was one of the best podcasts I've found so far in my young experience with podcasts. Her name's Daisy No. She is a high school student in Southern California and has made a true inspirational podcast just through peer interviews and constant uploads and really just experiencing the podcast. So, with that being said, I hope you enjoyed the interview. Once again, a big thank you to her, and make sure you go check out the Bright Eyed podcast. It's a really good podcast. She has weekly interviews and a mini-sode every month. So enjoy the interview and enjoy your podcast. Go check her out, and if you want to be a guest, make sure you apply. Thank you. What's up, guys? I'm Tyler Coker, and I'm your host for today's episode of Today with Tyler. I hope you enjoy. First of all, once again, thank you for joining me on the podcast. It's nice to have a guest. I like doing these interviews. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and the Bright Eye podcast?
Yes, I would love to. So, hi everyone. My name is Daisy. I am the host of the Bright Eyed podcast. I'm based in Southern California, so in Orange County. My podcast was kind of just my way of being able to talk to people during quarantine. I was really inspired by like all the teens who were creating nonprofits and becoming activists during the pandemic, and so having a podcast and getting to hear people's story, help share their story, that was a major motivation for me to start. And so I release weekly episodes interviewing inspiring teens from all over the world in hopes to empower young listeners who are tuning in and not so young listeners to make a difference and follow their passions.
So you said you started during quarantine. Was this something you had any experience with before, or was this all just like, hey, I have a bunch of extra time now. What am I going to do?
It was more the latter. I really had not done anything like a podcast before. But I don't want to say that I started off with nothing. I think as someone who, did public speaking, which is ironic as I mess up that sentence. But I grew up doing like debate and stuff like that. I come from like a musical theater background too. So I guess that part of me really just shone through. And I was always someone who really liked conversation and talking with people. So on the technical side of podcasting, I had zero experience, and that was something I had to YouTube and research and learn. Made a lot of mistakes, but definitely that more like connection, talking side is something that I was a little bit more comfortable with. So it was kind of a nice blend of depending on skills that I knew that I had and that I could rely on, and then also trying to learn how to edit audio, how I'm gonna record interviews. Is Zoom the best platform? Is it, should I use Audacity or GarageBand? Stuff like that was more learning, but I'm so glad that we got through that initial learning curve.
Yeah, it's certainly a big curve if you don't know what you're doing. So you have 3 seasons of your podcast, and your latest one has started in June. Is there a rhyme or a reason for like your seasons, or do you just kind of make a season out of whatever you really think?
Right. I love that. That's a good question. Honestly, so for me, I usually base it based on like my school year. But I think the reason why I wanted to do a season change is it kind of like gave me an opportunity to push myself a little bit more, try something new, which I could definitely do during the season. But I think just having that like from season 2 to season 3, what stuff do I want to add? Well, what do I want to like do next? Like for season 3, I started doing minisodes, so just like kind of side episodes, just tiny little less than 10-minute episodes that aren't interviews, but just kind of me talking about topics related to change making. So that was one example of something I started with the season change. And I think like as I keep doing the season changes, and I usually do that transition during the summer where I have more time to like plan it out. I think that's why I started changing. But what's also cool is I felt like it's like a new generation of like interviews that I'm talking to, not necessarily like better, but just like different. And so I just kind of like having each season be like a different phase of the podcast and seeing like how it grows with each one.
That's really interesting. So with these mini-sodes, it's something I had never really heard of or kind of thought of as a concept, but it was something
Right.
interesting that I was looking at your Instagram and your podcast and figuring out what exactly it was you do as I was preparing. How often do you release these mini-sodes, and what are some general topics you like to kind of bring up in these mini-sodes?
Right. So minisodes are one of my favorite parts about this podcasting process now. There was something that I really wanted to do. So what happened was is as I was interviewing people on the podcast, there were a lot of topics that would come up that I wish we could like dive more into. I remember I was talking to a mental health activist from Turkey who has a nonprofit. It's really cool. You should check it out. It's called One Smile Effect. But we were talking about like productivity and toxic productivity and burnout, and I really wish that we could have kept talking about it. And so minisodes are my opportunity as someone in these conversations to like find subtopics to dive deeper into, and I really wanted it to be bite-sized because they're intended to be a resource, so people tuning in can learn about the difference between toxic productivity and when productivity can be used for good. I've talked about how you can figure out what your strengths are, which was my most recent one, and that was a really fun one to talk about. I've done minisodes on just like the story of the podcast and how that all started. So it's kind of like a mini series in it of itself. And I've been releasing these once a month, just like in addition to the episodes that I'm putting out. It's been really fun. I really enjoy putting those together.
Yeah, that's just really a good concept. And you came up with that on your own, I assume?
Yeah, actually, I listen to a lot of podcasts. I don't really know where it came from. I'm sure the term Minnesota came from somewhere. I just
Yeah.
can't remember. But I definitely did want an excuse to keep like talking about the topics I wanted to.
That's awesome. So you were saying that you brought in a guest from Turkey. How does a guest become a guest on the podcast, and how do you reach these people, like for example in Turkey where it's not Southern California?
Right. So, like much like we were talking about before we started recording, I started off interviewing people that I knew. So it was all people I went to school with, maybe people I had known on Instagram as like people who have nonprofits and stuff like that. So I started really like within my own circle. And then I think a lot changed when I opened up a guest application. So instead of just relying on me to find people, it was a great opportunity for people to find me, which is great because I think it just filled my guest lineup with people who needed a platform and really wanted a platform to talk. And I think that really changed a lot about who I was able to interview. That was the first time I started interviewing internationally, which was a huge step. And I was always so nervous because I felt like I wasn't going to know what I about. But I really like my world and global perspective has grown so much during that process. So yeah, I think that guest application is a huge part of it. But then there's also like I'm always like I like to say that I'm like a fan of all the guests that are coming on. Like they're like celebrities. I'm like, oh, I've seen your nonprofit on Instagram. I'm so excited to talk to you. And that sentiment definitely like stays through. So I'll reach out to like accounts that I'm fans of. Like I got to interview someone from Dear Asian Youth. It's this really huge organization, student led, and they've done like so many awesome things for the Asian community. And so I was like fangirling that whole time I was interviewing. So yeah, it's a mixture of both that guest application and also me just reaching out and finding cool people in that community. And I think the more that I've reached out, the more my circle got bigger.
Awesome. So when you open your guest application, how big was your audience? Since it does seem kind of like impressive that you could find these great guests from international places, especially as a self-started podcast.
Right. It was definitely a process. I think at the beginning, I had opened up a guest application, I want to say maybe like in the middle of season one or like early season two. But I didn't really have a whole lot of responses. It was a lot of me just kind of being proactive. And then like eventually like something happened in like the middle of season two, and I experienced this like kind of like steady growth incline. And I think that's when a lot of people started filling out that guest application. I think at some point I had like 40 people in there just accumulated, just like, and I was like so excited to see that happen. And so it was definitely like a very like slow grow in the beginning, and then it kind of like speeded up, and now we're kind of like leveling off. But yeah, I think that was the moment when I realized that this podcast was something that not only that I wanted to do, but it was serving the need that I wanted it to, have. So that was a very like surreal moment, very affirming.
Yeah. So you were saying that your global perspective has really changed from all these great interviews you've been able to have. What would you say is some of the most valuable insight or conversations you've been able to have in your podcast? Now, I'm not asking you to pick a favorite, but just something that really stuck to you in a way that you hadn't really thought of before.
Right. And I'm glad you weren't asking me to pick a favorite, because that definitely would be hard. I'm sure you could relate. But for me, I think what's strange is that the conversations that I remember the most aren't usually the ones that happen during the podcast interview. So after I record my episodes, I'll stop recording. And of course, we don't just leave the Zoom call after that. We'll sort of stay after and chat a little bit. But I've had some really great connections with people just in that in between, just after recording. I remember I was talking to a sustainable fashion influencer in India. And then after the interview had conducted, we had like a 2 hour conversation after that, just like talking about, where we lived, and found a lot of stuff that we had in common. And then that's kind of one way that my global perspective had expanded, is I realized just like how much we have in common to people all over the world. Like the distance really says nothing about how you can relate and connect with each other. And I think that's a really beautiful thing about conversation, and the types of conversations that we have is like the same global issues that someone is fighting in India. It might be the same as someone fighting somewhere else. And of course, there are nuances and there's different like intersectionalities that could make each experience different, which is great about having a podcast, is you can explore all of that. But I think that's like a huge eye-opening part for me. And then to point out like a specific conversation that I had that sticks with me, I interviewed someone named Vaughn Michael, and that was like one of my favorite interviews. So he's an activist in the Philippines, an environmental activist, and I'd interviewed environmental activists before, but more in the States. And so when I had seen and heard from someone who was an activist for the same cause but in a totally different place, there was so much more that I learned about that issue. Just like racism within the environmental activist field itself, which I didn't notice before, because I'm not an activist in that field. So I think I learned a lot of different sides of an issue I had already talked about. And that really just like opened my eyes to like how much potential there is in talking about like the same thing, but from different perspectives. And I'm really never going to forget that. And I think that's like pushed me to strive to like look at different perspectives too.
That's awesome. That's what it's all about. I mean,
Exactly. Yeah.
so with all these great insights you've been able to have, and it seems really rewarding, I would say, and
Yes.
it's something that I also want to keep pursuing. Um, what would you say is the key thing that you have to do to start something where you can actually find these different perspectives or make a difference, or even just follow that dream that you've been thinking about for a long time?
Well, I think first and foremost, the most important thing to have is like a passion and drive. And I can totally see that in you and in a lot of the people that I talk to. Like there's this like inner deep desire to do what they want to do, because I'm sure you can relate, but like starting something like a podcast, like a nonprofit, really anything, it takes a lot of yourself. It's a lot of time. There's a lot of times where my podcast growth was definitely not linear. There were so many times where I was like, is anyone even listening? Like, is this is a lot of work. I feel overwhelmed, and it feels really hard to keep going at some points. And you have to really come to terms with that. But I think what makes a difference between, those things that kind of just fizzle out and those things that keep growing and just keep going, is that passion. So as long as you have that, honestly, a lot of other things can be taught, can be learned. And I guess it's better that way. Like for me, you could do as much research as you can, but you're never going to be fully prepared before you dive into something. And you're always going to be learning along the way. I remember there were some podcast episodes I had to edit like 3 or 4 times over because I didn't know how to convert the audio file right. I didn't know how to like export things. And so it's always going to be kind of like a struggle, but I think as long as you have that passion, that change will follow with you. And so no matter what happens, you're prepared and equipped to like adapt and keep going and follow through. So I think that passion is really important.
And the passion is clear with your podcast. I mean, you put in a lot of work, even to your Instagram posts, which is impressive. And what was actually suggested to me where I found your podcast. So, what, with that passion of yours and with the well-established podcast you have, what are some goals for the Bright Eye that you don't mind sharing? Like, what are your future aspirations for the podcast?
Yeah, so thank you so much also for all the kind words. That really means a lot. So for me, I think for the Bright Eyed, so I'm a senior in high school, so I'm at that kind of point where like college has come into the equation. Like I don't really know like what the future looks like because everything was so like set in stone for me up until this point. But for me, I think I want to expand the mission of the Bright Eyed. I love talking with teens, and I'm definitely going to continue talking with teens. But I think as I grow up and get older, I kind of want to be able to talk to and expand that audience. So maybe once I enter college, I would love to interview some college students who are making a difference and not so much stray away from that original mission of it, like inspiring people to make a difference, but just like expanding the types of people I talk to and therefore hopefully expanding the people I'm reaching. So I really want this to be a podcast that kind of like grows up as I grow up, I guess. And so I think that's where I'm headed in the future. And I'm not really sure where the future holds. I'm definitely a planner. So I like, thinking of my content calendar in advance and like listing all my goals and stuff. But I'm learning that like no amount of planning will really prepare you for what happens. And right now, that's less stressful and more exciting. So I think that's kind of like a general framework of what I'm hoping to do. But I'm honestly not that sure, but I'm excited to find out.
All right. Well, that's kind of the end of my questions. But now it's kind of a time to plug yourself. You know, if you had a suggestion to find one episode, or if you had to have a little bit of a moment to say what you're doing, what you're working on, go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can tune into the Bright Eyed really anywhere. The most popular platforms you can tune in from, Spotify, Apple Podcasts for free, Google Podcasts. You can follow my Instagram at the Bright Eyed Pod. And I post, reminders about episodes, but also helpful information and resources if you are interested in starting something or you just want motivation and inspiration. That can be a resource for you. If you want to be a guest, feel free to fill out a guest application. I would love to talk to you. And yeah, I just hope each episode motivates you. Episodes every single Monday. So
All right. Well, thanks for coming on.
thank
Yeah.
you so much for having me. This was really fun.
All right. Well, good luck with your endeavors.
Thank you. Same to you too.